communities, floating families of mixed parentage. Many of these families were people who had come from abroad, as you will see a few of the characters over here, and settled in the country and didn't go back after independence. Many people married into Indian families, like so you had, say, the Anglo-Indian community or the broader Eurasian communities. And because of this, the 50s, the 1950s, after independence, that's the era in which I was born in 51, and I saw these communities around me in cities like Calcutta, in Madras. I'm saying Madras because it was Madras at that time. It was in Bangalore, Allahabad, Lucknow, Kanpur, and many of the smaller and larger towns had large populations of mixed communities. In fact, McCluskeyGunj in the then Bihar was a state, I call it a state because it was an entire region which was given over to the Anglo-Indians to settle in. Unfortunately, it didn't hold and that community fell apart in McCluskeyGunj. So, you had this large body of people. Each family, I wouldn't even call them communities, each family carried with them a memory. Some type of ancestral memory, some memory of something which had passed. You know, their ancestors. And they were living in a land which was now an independent nation, with its own identity, with its new identity, the identity of being Indian. They didn't belong. Many of the friends I grew up with, they were Chinese, some of them of course were also the old Tibetan, they were French, they were Armenian, they were Jewish communities from various, they were Baghdadi Jews. And all of these people had lived and had grown up in our country, and yet when this new political identity was given, they were suddenly strangers. So now Sean Verma comes from one such family, and he grew up in the city of Calcutta. So I'm going to read you a small passage of the time when Sean Verma was in a certain part of Calcutta which was known for its very high cosmopolitanism. A number of mixed communities lived there. In fact, the one building in which he lived, there were many small apartments. It was like a bee's hive. Many small apartments of various people from various backgrounds were living there, all in a single place. It was almost epitomizing the outsider setting for a lot of communities in post-independence India. It was surprising how many families lived in that block. They were crammed into that block, which was like a veritable bee's hive, with some living in small flats tucked into every nook and cranny. The Tuckers were on our floor. James Tucker was a tall, lean fellow with stooping shoulders and a bald head that gleamed like a polished egg. His wife, Mary Lou Tucker, looked like a man. She had a moustache and a mole on her right jaw, which had stiff black hair standing up around it. They had adopted the son of a poor widow and brought the boy Billy up with lots of love, good clothes, and more food than his body actually needed. On the ground floor, there was the Rosario family, husband and wife, who put up the Rosario family on a ceramic name tile on their small front gate. Bach and Beethoven billowed out through the blue frilly curtained windows. Beside them were the Smiths, Colleen and Percy, a tiny couple who looked distinctly like twins. Their aged beagle looked like a relative. Aunt Colleen loved to make pickles and set out row upon row and jar upon jar outside their window in the sun. Up to their place came Peggy the air hostess. She threw wild parties and had strange men dropping in whenever she was in town. On the other side of the building, on the ground floor, were the Chongs, an old bullman. The Chongs were a family of 11 noisy brats with equally noisy parents. They had left China a couple of years before and had come to Calcutta to seek their fortune. Their neighbor, old bullman, was an ancient version of Desperate Dan, who was a comic character, old comic character. That Anglo-Indian had made his fortune, they said, shaking down people on behalf of moneylenders. So these were some of the characters, and in fact the most prominent character was this mysterious woman. The entire first floor was occupied by the Kaiser family. At least that's what I remember them being called. They were a mysterious lot who came and went like shadows. Whole books could have been written about what the neighbors had to say. Some said they had friends in the underworld, others that they bought and sold people, and others still that they landed up as shipwrecked survivors in Diamond Harbour and found their way to Calcutta to seek their fortune. They looked distinctly Middle Eastern. The mother of them all, at least that's what we called her, was a huge woman who was all wrapped up in colourful, loose, silky garments. Everyone called her Kaiser Auntie. We children were terrified of her. If we didn't obey the elders, we'd be warned. Kaiser Auntie will wrap you up in a big shawl and carry you off to a place from where you'll never return. Shh! Can you hear those footsteps? There. That's Kaiser Auntie. She won't take no for an answer. If she walks into the house and asks for you, then we'll have to hand you over, you understand? Kaiser Auntie will get you. So as a child, what was happening is Sean was growing up amongst these people who didn't belong anywhere. But they were still people with their own sort of identities which had absolutely no relationship with the emerging Indian identity. But yet, they had created a living space of their own, a multicultural environment of their own. Calcutta of the 50s was quite another sort of place to be in. Flexible, relaxed. People were not afraid to be themselves. At least the people whom mum and dad knew. This is Sean Verma talking. Even at the times when we were slipping down the ladder, we could still see a bit of the city's color and revel in it. Every evening, Anglo-Indian minstrels or street singers roamed the streets singly or in twos and threes, singing and strumming on their guitars. You could stand at your window and listen to them. And if you liked what they sang, you throw money on them. Or if you didn't like what they sang, they could ask them to sing something else. If they couldn't do that, they'd usually go away. Some people would throw a mug of water on them and chase them off. There was a singer named Jimmy Lantern. Now Jimmy Lantern is the change name of a real singer who used to walk the streets of Calcutta, and nobody knew which culture he belonged from or where he came from. Who'd roam the by-lanes crooning in a deep, rich voice. Everyone who heard him was amazed by the voice that flowed out of such a wee little fellow. He sang all of Dad's favorites and was once invited to croon at his birthday party. Happy to do that, he said, but I won't come to your home. What's that? Dad wanted to know. And when he wanted to know something, he was like a hyena. He sank his teeth in and never let go until he got an answer, which he believed to be true. I'm a street singer, the man said. So just imagine you're on the street and sing, the hyena persisted. I don't sing in houses, mister. There must be another reason. Dad wasn't going to give up. Stop being such a stubborn fellow. Dress up and come. You'll make more money in one evening than you've done all these years, because these singers were actually great singers. But they used to roam the streets and earn their living, which is also, in another way, an Indian tradition. But at that time, they were singing songs that had nothing to do with India. It was just their own tradition they were singing out of, their personal tradition. And a lot of that personal tradition was influenced by what was happening in the rest of the world and from the Western world. And then finally he said, I don't think so, mister. Not with clothes like these and a face like this. He stepped out of the shadows and stood under the street light. Dad let go of my hand when he saw the man. A frayed rag of a tie hung around a scrawny neck which supported a large misshapen head and a face with a deep scar that ran all the way along from the right corner of his mouth to above his right eyebrow. His clothes hung on him just as discarded garments hang on a scarecrow. Well, what did I just say, mister? So there were these people who all had their own identities, but they didn't belong anywhere. They roamed and they lived in the back streets of the city. Allahabad had the same sort of people, Lucknow had the same sort of people, Madras, and the Madras region, I'm using the word Madras instead of Chennai. Bangalore also had a similar tradition. And there they were, with their own lives, their own identities, and the world around them was changing so fast that very soon they would not be able to say who they were, or what they stood for. After all, they also were human beings, just like us. Just like the many Indians who may be in this room, those people were equally human. But where did they belong? Who were they? They were caught in the vortex of circumstance, of history, of time. Did they have an identity? Maybe they had a personal identity. Now, Sean Verma, grandfather, was actually a British soldier who fought in the First Great War. Now, it's based on my grandfather, who fought in the First Great War. He fought in Mesopotamia against, at that time, the Turkish army, and he was wounded. Now, this Alexander Harding, who's Sean's granddad, is really nothing like my granddad was, but my granddad was the inspiration for him. So this is when Sean Verma meets his grandfather for the first time, and his grandfather is this big fellow, really big guy, very tall, and he's fought in the war, and he's been this soldier, and he's been decorated. So he has all the memories of the war behind him. Now Sean Verma is a young man, young fellow rather, small chap, and he's growing up in a new land, a land that has just got its independence. And here he has to deal with a grandfather who is carrying his memories of his exploits fighting the Turks, which has no relevance to Sean anymore. But that's his grandfather. That's what he has inherited. That's a part of his identity and his inheritance. I'm going to read you an experience. This is the major experience that happens to him. It's probably to many of us it may have happened. I managed to get admission, a BA with English Literature and History. It was a joke. I disliked books, considered studying literature and history a waste of time. I found the Jesuit college in Calcutta far too serious for my liking. What relevance was all that learned seriousness if the world around me was in a mess? Calcutta was burning. Unemployment and injustice had driven thousands of young people beyond the limits of desperation to join the Naxalbari movement. In the name of the cause, innocent people lost their lives, and any person in any position of authority or power found his or her life threatened. Banks and business establishments were looted. Petty businessmen were shot, stabbed, or beheaded. I really couldn't understand why all this was happening. I wasn't into politics and was virtually clueless about why so many people my age were ganging up to set out on killing sprees. From my understanding of all the fracas, The poor and defenseless were ruining the happiness of the rich. There were heated debates in the college canteen and tea shops, but I was always the observer, sipping hot tea from a chipped cup and pulling on a beedi. For quite a while since the chaos had started in the city, I had not actually witnessed any shootout or murder. I had only heard people talking about bloody events, read a bit on the front page of newspapers, saw shattered glass on dry patches of blood on pavements, saw an ambulance leaving with the injured, until one afternoon in coffee house on College Street. Halfway through my cup of coffee, I looked up and noticed that everyone around me had stopped talking. There was a deathly silence and stillness. The man sitting at the table nearby had folded his newspaper and got up to leave, when there was a loud bang and he was thrown backwards against a pillar behind him. He slid down in slow motion and the next shot blew off a segment of his shoulder. He fell groveling about on the floor, trying to grab the marble top of the table with a hand that still worked. He knelt there for a moment, his eyes rolling in their sockets, focused on me, and his mouth open to say something. The third blast blew away his face, then his body slipped down and sprawled on the floor. So violent was the impact that my face and shirt was splashed with blood. There was chaos, people were screaming and scrambling for their exit, sirens whined. I dropped to the ground and crawled for cover. When the shooting subsided, I crawled out between chairs and tables and down the stairs into the street, walking most of my way to the hostel. So what happened to this man? He didn't understand what was happening. He was carrying with him a long, weighty story of families, of continents at war with each other. He was forged from the fractured pieces of history. And here he was in a new nation which was already at war with itself. And he couldn't understand why. This novel is the story of Sean Verma struggling to make sense of his life. There is no heroism here. There is just the struggle of one human being to find the path of peace for himself, to find a whole identity, which was almost an impossible task.